Before I became a beekeeper, I don't think I'd ever touched a microscope. And the first time I touched a microscope was when I was becoming a Master Beekeeper, because one of the aspects you have to do is cover disease inspection for part of the assessment. In fact, my skill set is I'm a communications engineer. I design internet networks. So it couldn't be any further from where we are today. So what I'm going to try and do, and it's really quite an ambitious talk for the next hour, is introduce you to microscopy. You'll maybe get some of the passion which I have for it. And then I'm going to really just briefly cover each aspect of producing slides and the types of slides you want to do. So why microscopy and beekeeping? First thing is understanding how a bee works, how a honeybee works. And once you understand how a honeybee works, you can understand how lots of other insects work. So this is a proboscis. It's not a very good picture of a proboscis, but it shows you the splayed out parts. And once you look at a proboscis, it's got different parts coming out on the outside, on the sides. Out here, we've just had a really good talk about proboscis and how it just ejects and can be quite sharp. But then you look at a fly. You have different types of flies. Some flies have got sharp proboscises and are held in place so that they can pierce your skin and sting you. Other ones come and try and take the substance off you. And it's just because the same components that's in a bee are in most majority of our other insects, but they just develop differently. So not only do you start looking at microscopy from a beekeeping point of view, it gets you to look at other insects and moving on. Verifying disease. There's only really two diseases we really worry about at our level for beekeeping. And one is acarine and the other one is nosema. And acarine, I've been doing acarine tests for a long, long time, and I've not seen acarine in a trachea. It will come, and I believe that as we do no treat, as we do more no treat for varroa, that acarine will come back, because acarine is managed by our varroa treatments. So, but for nosema, going back to acarine, what acarine does teach you is how to use the tools you need to use and accurately underneath a microscope, because you have to do some manipulations. In nosema, what we're looking at is getting ourselves into our first level of being able to look at something in much more detail than you can just see by just cutting out a proboscis and having a look at it. And then is learning about our honey. And a lot of people, the interest in microscopy is learning about your honey. And at first pass, you might say, well, I can just take some of my honey, stick it on a slide and look at it. But you have to understand, and you have to put a lot of work in behind so you know what you're looking at. There's no use trying to write an article on a topic which you haven't researched and when you haven't gone to a library. And what we have to do as beekeepers is, if we're going to try and understand what's within our honey, we've got to start to build up a library of what pollens are out there so that we can match them back into our honey. And it just becomes obsessive. I've just come back from Turkey. I go to Turkey twice a year. I've just come back from Turkey, and we sail. So we sailed right across from the Mediterranean to the Aegean Sea. And we came across this castle. So we're in this fantastic bay, which has been used for thousands of years as a harbour. And came into this castle, and we climbed up to this castle, and the blocks which made up this castle were the size of an armchair. No cement, massive blocks, and we walked around the ramparts. And my wife went off, and this normally happens when we go out for walks. She goes off, and she's out there for exercise and see the beauty. And she took this really beautiful film, which shows scans across the Mediterranean, going up to Marmaris, Rhodes, which is Greece, coming around to Sami, and back around and back into our harbour to see where our boat is. I appear in this towards the end because I'm looking at this plant. Well, this plant, I've seen it a lot, and it's a maritime plant, and it pops up in the autumn. It's not there in the spring, it's an autumn plant. And what I do when I go to these plants is the first thing I do is I see there's anthers and I rub the anthers. And you rub the anthers because you want to see if there's pollen on them. And if I see there's pollen on it, then I think, well, that's worth investigating. Why aren't there any bees here? Well, the reason why there weren't any bees there, because it gets up to 50 degrees temperature. There's no forage there for them, but there were butterflies, and the butterflies were foraging on them. And I have seen this plant in other locations where there is more shade, and there have been bees on it, particularly in the more populated areas. There was no population at all where we were. So my first instinct is take a photograph. You take a photograph, and the photograph then you can match it up with your app, and the app tells you that it's a squill. And a squill is basically an onion, or the onion family. It's got a bulb which is about 1 kilogram in weight, so it's an onion which would be about 1 kilogram in weight. So I now know everything about this plant, and it's poisonous. Like all plants, it's poisonous. But I also know, and I couldn't have told you this before I became a beekeeper, it's a monocotyledon. And monocotyledons have veins and leaves that come up vertically. And you learn this by trying to understand what's in your bees and your honey, because then you go on and learn about the plants. So it's a monocotyledon. Also, I found out that it's kind of the same family as an onion. There's a bluebell, your snowdrop, your garlics. It comes up, and bees do go on to snowdrops. They do go on to bluebells. And so I think, well, I'm stuck here in the middle of nowhere, but I've got my phone and I've got internet access. I'll Google pollen, image of pollen for a squill. And there's this nice site called Pol Data, which is in Switzerland, and it pulls you up the pollen. So you can look at the pollen, and the pollen from monocotyledons is generally a boat shape. So a boat shape in this terms is one straightish side with a curve. And normally they only have one thing called a furrow, and I'll talk about furrows later, but only got one furrow. And you can kind of see this. So I've got all the information I ever want about this plant now. I've got an image, and I've got a photograph of the plant, and I know where it was. So why do I worry about it? I've got in my backpack a little piece of paper, folded paper, because what you do is you cut the anthers off, or you cut the flowers off, and you put a piece of paper, and you get back. Because I don't trust that picture. It's not the picture, because it might not be the same picture for the squill, which is in that part of Turkey. And the bluebell which you have in your garden might be a different bluebell to one that's in someone else's garden. And if we're going to try and understand what's in our plant, in our honeys, the first thing we've got to do is understand what the general shape is of a plant and a plant type species. Rosaceae, which we'll talk about a wee bit later on, is very, very common. And it is a hell of a thing to try and differentiate between a hawthorn or a bramley or any other kind of Rosaceae flower. So it gets obsessive. And this is only one of my obsessions. When they get into insects or on a walk, my wife does a mile to my 50 yards. So let's go down to technology. If you traditionally, when I first went to my class, Bob Smith was the first person who introduced me to microscopy. And we all had to have these jeweler's loupes to look at the flowers and look at what's in the flower and where the anther is and what state it is. And but now all you need is your mobile phone, because if you're going to identify a flower, you just take your photograph, and there's apps out there which help you identify it. The mobile phone, we do workshops here, and it's quite amazing. I don't have to tell anyone about mobile phones and microscopes. Within the first couple of sessions of doing your first couple of slides, people have got their mobile phones out and they've got them going down the eyepieces and taking photographs. We're all so used to trying to take photographs and take it, and people are getting very good pictures from that. But for a beekeeper, we only need really very, very little equipment. The first piece of equipment we need is a stereoscope microscope. And it doesn't need to be more than, well, normally two times magnification and 4 times magnification down here. The way in which this microscope works is it shines a light, just like us looking at anything. It shines a light and the light reflects off the object. So a light comes from a little source here. LEDs is a good light source to make sure it's an LED, and the light reflects off. And just like the binoculars you have 2 lenses and a binocular, and you have an eyepiece up here. So you take the magnification down at the bottom, which is ×2 or ×4, and multiply it by the magnification at the top, which is the eyepiece, and that gives you the magnification of that microscope. So all we need is ×20. These are normally ×10 and ×2. That's ×20 magnification. ×10 ×4 is 40 times magnification, and that's good enough for anything we want to do in anatomy, and for when we're doing things to dissect. Some people call this a dissecting microscope because all we wanted to do is dissect and cut up our bits to prepare our slides or whatever we were going to do. The other pieces of equipment we need is a compound microscope. This is a much more powerful microscope. This has a turret, and you can see the lenses here have a much finer aperture, a much tighter aperture, so they can focus down on the object in which they want to look at. But the light source is down the bottom. So the light source comes up through the object, which has got the slide on top of it, through this objective lens, which starts at ×4. And normally when you buy them, they've got a turret of 4, which goes 4, 10, 40, and 100. For beekeeping, you don't need the 100. For beekeeping, we can go, I normally take the 100 out and I put a 60 in. So what that does is increase the detail of when you're looking at an object, but you don't have to do anything like oil immersion, or you don't have to do anything special to the slide so that you can see. So it just gives you one more layer. So you just turn the turret and you magnify up. And as you magnify up, again, the lens at the top, the eyepiece is ×10, so it starts at 40 and can go up to 1,000 magnification. So these two are the only 2 microscopes. And I bought mine, so I think I did my advanced husbandry in 2013. I bought them and they're still working, and they still get used, and they're used regularly. So once you buy them, you're buying them for duration. So you just set your budget. You can buy microscopes which are sub £200. You can buy microscopes which are over £1,000 or multiple £1,000. But sitting something which is about £200 £300 is more than enough for a beekeeper here, and less than £150 for a beekeeper there. The other thing you need is a set of tools. And I never recommend buying a stock set of tools for microscopy. Make up your tools yourself. And the best places are eBay and Amazon for making up the bits you want to do. And a toolkit, the only thing which is unique to a toolkit for a beekeeper is an acrine pin. And you can see it's a pin which has got 2 pins in it. Because if you stick a pin through a bee and you're trying to play around with it, it spins. So you put 2 pins in and then it won't spin, and you can do what you want to do to it. You have to have a scalpel, and a scalpel you have as a number 3 handle and number 11 blade, because you want to have it as pointy as possible. So when you're cutting things into it, you want to make them. So some of the kits I see, which you can buy off stock, off the shelf, have butcher's knives, and you're never going to get anything which you can actually get into any detail. But the most key part is what I will talk about as a seeker. And a seeker is a very pointy thing, very sharp, pointy thing, and that's what you play with when you're actually looking at things. So a toolkit is not an expensive thing. So to get started, it's slightly cheaper than getting started at beekeeping, but the cost doesn't go up much more. So if we look at a stereo microscope and what we can do with a stereo microscope is, the first thing is we can dissect bees. So here I have a wax tray filled with wax, and you use a soldering iron and you make a puddle and you drop the bee in. and you submerge the bee with 50-50 alcohol, IPA and water, so it's completely submerged. And then you can then cut the shell, cut the cuticle off, and you can get into the bee, and you can then investigate what's going on. And the wax, when you've embedded the bee in the wax, is holding the bee. And it does. I like to use as dirty as wax as possible in this. This is pretty clean for me, because when you take the shell off and you look at it inside, you want to take the inner parts off. You want to look at the ventriculus, which is the intestines, the rectum of the bee. And a lot of the components inside are white. And if you have a nice yellow wax and you bring the components out and they're white, the contrast isn't there. But if you have a dirty wax, my best wax is dark brown, then the contrast works very, very well there. And you can see I've got my ×2, so it's on 20 times magnification, and that's all you need for dissecting a bee. Of course, I've got my scalpel and I've got my seeker. So a lot of us, when we're studying, so maybe we're studying module 5 for bee anatomy, we use Dade. Dade is a book, and Dade has nice pictures, and Dade is the standard that BBKA uses for any of its presentations of any of its anatomy, but it doesn't tell you much. It doesn't give you reality. Being able to see a sting, and it doesn't take long, or it's not that hard to get a sting. So if I've got that wax tray, and I've bedded my bee in, I go in and I cut off the back of the cell, the dorsal cell of the abdomen, and I peel that off, and I just start to play inside. And once I've finished playing inside, looking at the ventriculus, and I look at the rectum, I just cut them off, put them to the side, and then it's no harder than you have to just trust yourself. You take your seeker and you just jab it in and you flick it up, and out comes the sting. And it's quite amazing how the cuticle, because comes from the last segments of the bee's abdomen, is so visible. And when you see the sting, in reality, you can imagine it. Because, for instance, for the first 4 or 5 stings I took out, I couldn't work out why I was missing this very strong indication, which is a sheath. The sheath is here, it's quite transparent. When you think about it, when we talk about the sting going into someone's body, it goes in and it sticks, and we imagine it's like a fish hook. But the fish hooks aren't, look, they're very fine there. They're even much finer on the actual sting. It's very difficult to see it. But you can imagine how the sting works, because you've got a ramus with sting here that goes all the way around, and it's connected by the triangular plate, the oblong plate, and the quadrant plate, and they oscillate and they move in doing that. And if you're lucky enough, because what you do is when you're making space to take the sting out, you'll see a clear sac, which is the poison sac, with the glands hanging off it. So you take the sting out, you've got the gland, the poison sac, and the sting, and you can see the whole system works. And you can understand much better how the system works. Also, when the sting comes out, it doesn't come out flat, it comes out like that. So it's got 2 halves, and you've got very strong muscles on either side, so it can drive the ramus into its victim. I think you must probably guess this is queen's ovaries. Oh. One of the problems is it's very, very easy to take a piece of a bee out in an abdomen, but it's very hard to take a photograph once it's there. This one's great because it gives you the full view. The way in which the queen's ovaries work is you have germ cells, which is a single cells which generate the cells which then divide and then become the egg. Then you have a sausage factory. And you have well over 180 sausage factories split in 2, and that's the eggs developing as they come down. So you can imagine, you can't see this in a picture unless you touch it. And then as it comes down, the eggs get mature. So you can see the little sausages down here are small, and they're bigger here. And they've all come from one cell, from the germ cell, and they've divided, and you've got the follicle cells out on the outside. And then at the top, you've got the lateral oviduct. So the egg is spurted out into the lateral oviduct, and it goes down into the middle oviduct, which is here. And then you have a ball above, which is called the spermatheca. That's where the sperm is stored from the queen, from a drone in the queen. If it's clear like that, it was a virgin queen. If it's opaque, it's full of sperm. So what you've got is you can see and you can imagine it. It's much, much better than seeing a picture, is to be able to understand. But then the hard bit is making up an anatomy slide for you to present that and to be able to imagine it. Because what you have to do, you have to stain it, you have to dry it, you have to put it in a medium which makes it durable and can last. Wax glands. We all know wax comes out of the abdomen of the bee. But how does it do it? So if you turn the bee over, so rather than putting the bee face down in the wax, you turn the bee over the other way in the wax, so it's got the ventral sides showing up, you can cut out the segments. So you have the segments where the wax is coming out, and then you understand that because underneath one and the other is the mirror. This is what they call mirrors, and the mirrors sit underneath the cuticle of the previous segment, and the glands, well, you've got to look upside down, you have a big thickening of fat body, or equivalent of fat body, above, and it basically produces the chemicals. And as they ooze out, so this is fat body, the yellow here, and as it oozes out, it turns into wax, solidifies, and it comes out in the segments. And to get your mind around it, so when I did my Module 5, I read Celia Davis's book, and I read this section inside out, and I read it inside out, and I still could not get the concept of a mirror sitting in a bee. But the minute you go in there and you dissect the bee and you can then see how it works, then that gets you the picture, which actually helps you in when you're studying. So moving on to disease. The bee has trachea, which take air from the outside, so you have holes all the way down, spiracles all the way down the side of the bee, and you have the air comes in through the spiracles, goes into trachea, goes into air sacs for intermediate storage, and then gets distributed out through the tracheoles. The biggest trachea is the one on the second segment of the thorax. So the bees have head, thorax, abdomen. So on the second segment of the thorax, there is a hole here. And the trachea comes in here, and this hole is not closed. It can't be closed fully, and therefore the acrine mite can go in, because it's the biggest one. Because you imagine it's got all the stuff up here. It's got all the wing muscles to feed. You want lots of air coming in through T2, and you want to also got to feed the brain. And we've all just seen in the previous talk how much effort the brain needs. So you've got all the air coming in. The acrine mite climbs through this tube, climbs through the spiracle, and comes in here on the trachea. And it has this life cycle very similar to Varroa. And that's why the Varroa sides work against the acrine. And it will pierce through the trachea, and it will feed, and it will then produce young. The young mate in the cell, and then the young will go out back the way they came. So what we want to do in bees, and this problem is you've got to kill the bees to actually find out if there is an infection, is you want to come in and you want to see if the trachea are pearly white. And that's what this is. That's a good trachea. The problem is bees have got a collar. And the collar, you can feel here, just like your collar. The acrine likes to be down here. So when you take the head off the bee, what you do is you put your 2 pins through the bee's thorax to hold it in place, and you just ease. With the backside of your scalpel, you just ease the first pair of legs and rock. And you rock gently, and that then takes off the head and the first pair of legs, and this is what you see. And you can see a pair of trachea going there, and just a little bit out there. The issue is, out here is where the acheron is, and that's where we've got to look. So what we have to do is we take a cut here and here, and we just ease off to expose the bits here. And when we can expose the bits here, then we can see whether there's an infection for the acheron, because that's where the staining comes from and the evidence that the acheron's been there. And this is what acheron looks like. These are a couple of slides. I don't know if I'm a lucky person or a dustbin. Whenever I go to Stoneleigh, and anything they've been cleaning out their cupboards, anything to do with microscopy, they just give me a pile of boxes. And these were slides from a collection called the Wendover collection, and I haven't worked out why the Wendover collection. I live in Wendover, and I don't know the person that did these slides. But this is acheron. These blobs here are acheron in there. But we're unlikely to see that. What we would see is these brown stains, and those brown stains is where the piercing goes through the trachea. And that's what the first sign is. And what you do is, if you suspect that you've got acheron or an infestation, you cut off a segment and you put it onto a higher power microscope, the compound microscope, and then you have a look and see and investigate what's going on. These slides were made, I'm guessing, 20, 30 years ago, and they're still good today. So that's the beauty of building up a library. If you build up a library of slides, of things that you're interested in, be it parts of a bee, anatomy, or be it a pollen, but if you do it correctly, those slides will be good for a long period of time. And one of the collections they gave me was a Rexoias collection. The slides they are quite old, but they are, and they do need some repair work done to them, but you can still see the pollens that he worked on to produce his book, which is the reference book that we all use for pollens. So this is a spiracle. I don't know anyone who's done, that's the size of a spiracle. So if you imagine, you can just see it, you can just make it out. So this isn't of T1, T2, this is of the further down. So the first spiracle is directly connected to the trachea. This is one here. It's directly connected to the trachea, and the air comes in, and you can just see the hairs on there, which close off, and the acheron can just go through, particularly on young bees, because the hairs haven't developed and they're not hardened. They can go through. And also, I don't know if people are interested, you can just see lines going across. You know, on hose pipes, when you buy a hose pipe, it's got these lines to keep it rigid. So the trachea have things called ctenidia, and the ctenidia are rings of cuticle which hold the strength, so the trachea doesn't collapse inside the body. But anyway, so sometimes you want to look closer in, because that is at which is probably 20 or times 40. You want to come up and look. The amazing thing is, when you look at a bee, we all know a bee is hairy, but hairs grow everywhere. They grow out their eyes, they grow out through their spiracles, they grow absolutely everywhere, and that's what we have. And also, some of these will be sense organs. And then this is too big, because what happens is, when you have a specimen, and the specimen, the proportion, the level in which you can go down in the detail, it can blur if you go if you magnify it too much, or it's not enough detail if you don't magnify it enough. So what you have to do is you have to judge. So it's not like always going for the fastest car. You have to choose the magnification which is appropriate. And I think this magnification is better than this one, because it shows the crispness. In fact, that one's quite good because it gives you the overall view of it. So when you're doing microscopy and you're trying to take photographs and show people what you're trying to present, you set the magnification appropriate to the size of the object which you're trying to view. Hopefully that makes sense. But sometimes you need a little bit more, and that's when we go onto the compound microscope. My very first experience of microscopy in beekeeping was, I was the apiary manager at my local association, and the chairman said, we want to do some Nosema testing. You can run it, Sean, because I'm on holiday. Here's a microscope and slides. And I said, well, I'm always up for a challenge, I'll try it. And I didn't find one Nosema all day. you have to set these up, and there is a protocol. And if anyone looks at anything I do, I've written it down, and there's a set procedure. The first thing you have to do is make sure you can focus going down. The second thing you do is you focus the light so that where you've got a thing called the condenser here, so that the light is at the optimum focus at the point in which you're looking at the object. So the light coming up and there, and you've got the focus on there so that you're all in sync. The next thing you want to check out is that the tube you've got is taking the right amount of light. If you try and take too much light, so I don't know if you remember from physics at school, light when it hits a joint, so it's between, say it's between water and air, it goes like that. That's why when you're looking at fish in the water, the fish look bigger, because it spreads it out. If you catch too much light of this stuff, it detracts from the object you're looking at. So what you've got to do is make sure you've got parallel light beam coming up, focused on the object, and then focused on your eye. So you're seeing the right amount of light. Too much light is wrong. So you have to set that up. And every time you pick your microscope up, even if you haven't used it for a long time, even if you used it yesterday, sorry, you've got to reset it and make sure it's set optimum. That's where you get the best image. And then you have a little filter down here, and you can put little colours in. And if you put blue in, you can see right down to a much smaller detail because you're cutting out the other light. And the wavelength of blue is such that you can see a much smaller object. You can go down to about 2 microns. So the neuron's head was 3 microns. Is that 3 microns on your picture, the red picture? So it's about that size. And that's what we need for Nosema. So these are 5 to 8 microns by 2 to 3 microns, and that's at 400 times magnification. And that's as far as we need to go within beekeeping. So what you have, you take a sample of mature bees, foragers, from the outside of the hive. Take 30, I put them into a plastic bag. The Ziploc bags, and I just squash them. Sorry, I put a little bit of water in as well. So what I do, the books all say different things. And what I do is I put the bees into the corner of the bag, and I fill to the top line of the bee. And that normally works for me, the top line of the pool, and I squash. And it should look like a kind of caramel colour. So you squash them, and if it's not caramel colour, just put a little bit more water in. You're squashing the bees, and that's all you have to do, having taken the thorax and the head off beforehand. So you're just doing the abdomen. And then you take a dab of that onto a slide and just put a cover slip on it, and you look down in it. And at 400 times, you're seeing Nosema. If I saw Nosema now, it's difficult, but if you can convert what to do, you know that you're going to struggle with your colony, because what happens with Nosema, the Nosema prevents the bees from consuming proteins, and proteins are what are required for the glands to develop. If the glands don't develop, it matures into an older bee without looking after the young, and the colony goes into decline. And that's why we want to know if we've got Nosema. And there are things we can do, which is outside of this talk, on if we detect Nosema. But how do you know if you've got Nosema bad or not? Because Nosema is pretty endemic. If you looked hard enough on every bee, you would probably find 1 or 2 little spores. These are spores, like seeds, quite a hard shell. So what I do is if I make a slide, and I put my slide underneath onto the stage, this mechanical stage, and I get the light going through the middle of the slide, and I do this for everything. If I get light going through, so I can look at the side and I can move everything around so I can see the light beam going through the middle of the slide cover slip. I look at that, and then I look down. And if I see Nosema in my first view, and this is a first view photograph, then that says I've got lots of Nosema. If I have to hunt for Nosema, if I have to hunt hard for Nosema, then that's not at a level which is of concern. This is of concern. And there's no real measurement on Nosema, but what we want to do is, it's costing us 30 bees every time we do a test. And when you do your test, and if you see it and you see it easily, then you should be concerned and then take other actions. Really, what most beekeepers are interested in is pollen. So here's a drawing. It shows you these little holes here, shows you the skin. What you do is you take your pollen. This is hazel. This hazel is normally 25 microns in size, and it can be used as a measure. So I have put it into the National Honey Show from the slides. I've mixed in some hazel so that you can see, so you can scale the pollen which you're looking at. But pollens have an X sign, and then the X sign has got two lines when you look at it, when you're looking at your microscope. So when you're looking at a microscope, you drill down. There's two levels on a microscope. One's called the polar and one's called the equatorial. So the easiest one is the equatorial. You focus, because remember the pollen is 3D, it's an object. You focus up and down, and if you focus so you can see the outside image line of the pollen well, then that's called the equatorial. And that equatorial view can show you the skin, the thickness of the skin of the pollen, and then you pull back up, and as you pull back up, you see the surface, and that's the polar view. And what we can do is, if we know the shape, the size, the number of little holes like these, and the surface, and the X sign, and other features like that, then we can work out what pollen that is and what plant that's come from. To do that, we just need some very simple things. So we need a stain, and I use Vuxin stain, which I put into a top of a Petri dish, because the easiest thing in the world, and this is one which I take out on classes, and I tell people to be very, very careful not to mix and to clean the tools between uses. And here I have lots of bits of pollen all over that. So the person who's going to make a pollen slide from that one next time is going to say, well, I'm meant to be looking at lily, but there's lots of hazel in here. So decant your stain into something small and usable in a method so you can use it, because you don't want to buy a little jar of stain and then find that you've contaminated it on first day. Some watch glass, and this is a coffee warmer, a USB coffee warmer. So when you're what you do is you stain a pollen to bring out the colour, and what the stain does, it kind of expands the shell of the pollen so that it makes the surface easier to determine. So you've got a colour stain, but you need to heat the stain for it to be taken up by the pollen. And you just put the slide, a clean slide, on top of here, dry off any liquid you've got on the pollen sample, put the stain on, put the cover slip on, and the USB coffee warmer will do the rest. It goes out into a nice slide, take it off, let it cool, and go look under the microscope. If you're trying to so some people, myself included, I like to make slides so I can get a good representative of the pollen. I'm not really that interested in having the perfect slide. But if you want to have a perfect slide and you want to come to the National Honey Show and present it, then you worry about air bubbles. And you maybe spend more time in doing it. But to make a simple slide to see what the pollen is, and I've got my little pouch of pollen from the squill. When I come round to that pouch is good, we're going to be good for years, because pollen lasts for years. When I come round to making my slide from that, I will just do it this way. I'll just have a watch glass. I put some IPA in here to get rid of any grease. Put my anthers in there. I put swirl it round, that gets some pollen, put it onto the slide, put it on here to dry off, put some stain on, cover slip, Bob's your uncle. It's a very simple way of doing it, and it gives you a very good image going forward. This is ideal little flower. I don't know what flower it is. I've taken a picture of it. So obviously I thought it was quite interesting at the time. But it's got the pollen. You can see the pollen on the anthers. When you want to find out, so what you do is, I go around my garden and the surrounding area, and at set times throughout the season, I find a flower, I cut the flower, and I store the anthers, and I store the pollen, because that's telling me what, and I know which tree it is, so I've marked it down that it's a sycamore, or if it's a field maple, or it's a hawthorn, or whatever. So I now know what tree that pollen came from because I got the anthers. But what I do is when I choose my flower, I would be more likely to take the branch with several flowers on it when they're closed. Because when they're open, you don't know who's been visiting there, and you don't know where they've been before. And so they can leave other pollens. So if you take a flower which is closed, put it in a window and let the sun open it up, then you allow the anthers to dehiss. So an anther is something like this, and it dehisses. And when it dehisses, the pollen's then exposed, and then you can use that for making your pollen slides. Then you know you've got an unadulterated flower or anther for your pollens. And if I can't do anything about it, different flowers work differently. If you take a hazel and you put it in a vase and put 2 pieces of A4 paper underneath the vase, you will have a mountain of pollen by just leaving it by a window. The same goes for oilseed rape. If you have a willow, you take the willow catkins, and when they've opened up, you just bang the willow catkins like a drum on a piece of paper. Every different pollen works differently, or every flower works differently. So we've now got a library. We've been around, we've checked our flowers. For a couple of days in the summer or throughout the season, just put your Varroa board underneath your beehive and take it out, and you've got pollen loads. So you've got your pollen loads, and you then can make a slide with a pollen load. So you now know what your bees are bringing in. Because when you go on shows and people come up to you on an agricultural show or any other kind of show, there's 2 questions they ask you. What should I plant in my garden to encourage the bees? And what's in this honey? And though if you want to find out what's in the honey, just put your Varroa board in, collect your little bits of pollen, you put that into the watch glass, you mix it. But the problem is, the bees, when they mix it, they compound it. There's lots and lots and lots of pollen in one of those pollen loads, and you've got to put lots of alcohol to break it up. But once you've done that, that works, and you know what you got. Or you say, what's in that honey? You can take a test tube. What I do is this is a small test tube, any kind of item. I put a good teaspoon of honey into the tube. I then put warm water into it. I put hot water, not boiling water, hot water, and I shake it. And for the next 5-6 hours, I put it on. I have this is a nice winter job. I have a storage heater in my office. I put it on top of the storage heater. I do 4 tubes at a time, and I'll shake. Every time I walk past, I'll shake it to make sure the honey is distributed throughout the liquid. And then you just tip off the top once you've got it, and you'll find you're left with a sediment at the bottom. You can top it up with fresh water to get rid of more honey, because what you don't want to do is do a slide of sugar. Slide of sugar messes everything up. So what you want to do is the honey to go into the water to drain it off, and then you just stick your glass rod in the bottom, dab it onto your slide, Bob's your uncle, you've got a slide of that honey. Or what I do now, if I haven't got much time, I bought from eBay in the brewing section, you get 10 micron filters. And I warm this up, make sure it's shaken all the way through, and I pour it straight through the sieve. And then dribble warm water through, and then I'm left with a sediment on the 10 micron filter of the pollens I want to look at. So this is Rex Sawyer's guide. So remember I talked to you about measurements. I'm not going to go through them all, but it's a very, very simple guide. But what you are interested in is what the surface looks like. You've got lots of different types of surfaces. What the X sign looks like. This one here is a ivy. It's got what you call a furrow and a pore. Furrows and pores are are places where the pollen tube comes out to fertilize the flower. Now I'm going to show you. So if you don't do anything and you go and look at your honey, these are 3 distinct plants. One's a bramley, One's a hawthorn, and I'm not going to tell you which one, but you can see how close they all look. And when you have to get down to the detail of what the surface is and what the size is, that's the only way of determining what one's is. Unless you've been out there when the bramley was in flower and you took a bramley pollen, or the hawthorn was in flower, you can then compare what you've got in your honey with what you've got here, and that tells you what you've got. Boragacea starts at forget-me-nots and comes through comfrey and to borage. Very similar. So families of plants, apart from this one, I'll put the forget-me-not in there because it's the smallest one we're going to get in the UK, 5 microns. And then we've got the families. Once you work out what a family looks like, you can work out your pollen. So this is a honey sample, and you can see lots and lots of different ones in here. You've got the rosaceae in there, you've got some oilseed rape in there, you've got some trifolium in there, and if I looked hard enough, there would be heather, because it was sold as heather honey. It can look like heather honey, it can smell like heather honey, but you can very hard to find heather pollen, because heather pollen is what you call underrepresented. You don't get a lot of pollen off a heather plant that goes into the heather honey, whereas other ones like forget-me-not are overrepresented. So if you see a lot of forget-me-not pollen in a honey, then that doesn't mean they've only foraged on forget-me-not, it just means it's overrepresented. And then this one came from Turkey. Where the region I go to in Turkey is a very big region for honeydew. And this is honeydew honey. But trying to work out, if you don't have a library, what all these different ones are in your honey is a very hard thing to do. I'm going to move on briefly to talk about making anatomy slides. It's the most frustrating thing you can ever... It takes 7 days to get from the beginning to the end, at least, for your slide. So if you're going to do any anatomy slides, do 10 at a time of the same thing, because hopefully one of them will turn out as being good. And you have to preserve it. So you fix it. You put your bit of your body into alcohol for 24 hours, into IPA for 24 hours. And that fixes it, that stops it decaying. And then for the hardened parts like the legs, you've got to put them in bleach, a form of bleach, and then for 3 days. And then what happens is the colouring in the cuticle goes down, because if you have the dark surface, so if you had something like that and you try to look through a microscope, you're not going to be able to see the detail because it's all black. The bleach clears it off and turns it into something which is browner, and you can then see the detail. But if you leave it in there too long, it then disappears completely. So it's a timing thing. And I had a lady last year who was doing her microscopy assessment, and she said, I've been bleaching and softening my legs for 2 weeks, and they still haven't gone. It depends on the bee. I said, go find some bees from someone else, and those bees worked within 3 days. It just depends on the bees. You can't tell. You wash it, and then you've got to decalcify it. You've got calcium inside the tissues, and you've got to decalcify it. You want to basically have a soft, pliable specimen to be able to work. You wash it, then you flatten it, and I'll show you how I flatten them. Dehydrate them so they're dry, and then you mount them. So you've gone through the 7 days. You've gone through the 7 days, and you then put them into new mount at the end, and that takes several days to set, and you put it into a warming cupboard so it sets, and lo and behold, the whole thing's full of air bubbles, and you have to go back to the beginning and start again. It's frustrating. So just accept air bubbles, that's all I say. So the complete preparation, then no one's written this down. This is the first time you might have seen it. No one's done this. Some require complete preparation, or from the beginning to the end, and some don't. So if you've got mouth parts or soft parts, things that don't have strong cuticle in them and don't need flattening, then you don't have to go through the first 3 or 4 days. And some of them benefit from acetic acid. I like to put it in acetic acid because basically it cleans the specimen up. When you're preparing an anatomy slide, be really aggressive in taking the parts out the bee. So when you're taking wings, take the pair of the wings at the same time and all the cuticle around, and then etch it away bit by bit. If you try and take a specimen of a bee, which is going to be perfect, for instance, legs. Quite often people take legs, and here we are. You've got to get the coxa at the end. And if you try and take it clean and make the cut there, that never comes. So be aggressive on the outside, you've got cuticle, and then etch your way back in, and that then gives you a good slide. This is how you flatten. You put your 3 legs on between 2 slides and a couple of paper clips, and then you immerse them. But I cheat. This one here, this slide here, you don't have to do things which are on the microscopy assessment syllabus. You can do whatever you want. This one's a neat one. These are all the segments, the dorsal plates of a bee. And that is decades old. And that's what you call a permanent slide. You choose things that you want to do. To do it. But when you're doing it, flatten it. So I cheat. I don't use New Mountain anymore. I use UV locker, which is a UV glass. It's what they use to repair your mobile phone screens. You put your specimen into the locker, into a bubble in the locker, and you can play with it. And you can play with it. It won't set, and you get rid of the bubbles. You fold it up and sink it, and the bubbles go out. And then you put your cover slip on, put it underneath the nail bar. It's cheap. That's £9.99. That's £2.50. And it's not bad chemicals lying around in your house. And you get a very, very clear permanent. Because it's locker, because it's got the same refractive index as glass, that's why they use it on the mobile phone screens, then you're still going to get a clean position, clean image. If I was advising you to, if you want to take up microscopy, I'd say set it up as a permanent location in your house. Set up a desk with your 2 microscopes. It doesn't have to be right and left, but whenever I set them up as my compound microscope on the right and my dissecting microscope or my stereoscope microscope on the left, and a computer in the middle with a camera, which I put into the eyepieces. And that's you've got your working space. If you're permanently set up, then you will be more inclined to make slides and do microscopy as things go and happen. And if you are serious, form a group, form a local group. So we have a group, we have 50 members of our group in the county, and we meet once a month, and it works very well. Then because people feed off each other. So when I sat my microscopy assessment, there were 6 of us in the group, and they said, well, you do it first, Sean. And then they would understand and they do it afterwards. But at least you're feeding off each other what works and what doesn't work. And that's the way it goes. There's only 3 books you need to get started in microscopy. Rex Sawyer's Pollen Guide, Bob Moira's Practical Microscopy for Beekeepers, and Dade, because Dade has very, very good pictures and very, very good plates of what you're meant to be looking at, and so you can understand what you're looking at.
You mentioned an app for identifying the flowers and the pollen. Could you just let me know what it is, please?
The one I use is PlantNet. You just take a photograph and it identifies it there.
If you get like apples, lots of different varieties, are the pollen grains the same shape or do they vary?
They'll be the same shape, but they may vary in size. And yeah, they may vary in size, but all rosaceae are triangular with white ends on them.
Yeah. The other thing, based on that, you get 2 hawthorns in this country, the common hawthorn and the Midland hawthorn, but in the wild you get a lot of hybrids. I'm told that the 2 hawthorns, the main ones, are different shapes. Are the hybrids always the same shape?
They all should follow a general triangular shape. The problem, the thing that differs is the surface of the pollens and the sizes of the pollens. So, and the compatibility of a pollen to going onto the stigma on the pistil, onto the flower, is that when it comes on, it first has to lock like a key. Then it has to lock. Then it has to have a chemical exchange, and there's a liquid exchange between the two. And then that only when you have a compatible pollen that's locked and has the fluid exchange do you then get the growth of the splitting of the pollen and the growth of the pollen tube that comes down to fertilize the flower. So, but families, and there will always be exceptions, because you see on the forget-me-not, the forget-me-not is completely different to anything else in the Boriaceae family. But generally, in families, all the same. So if you see something, it will be you can guess the type of flower, the family, but unless you've got a library to reference it back, and I haven't gone around all of hawthorns, I've just done hawthorns which are local, and that's the only way you're going to compare. The one that is the hardest is the mustards and the oilseed rapes. They all look like, very distinctive, they've got a netted surface and they've got 3 furrows, but they all look the same, and they all look like propellers when you look down the microscope at them. But the only difference in them practically is just the size on them.
Quite often, well, always, when a different species of plant come into flower, you get the pollen production over a period of time. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks sometimes. Do you see any differences in the pollen shape or size depending on when during the flowering season it happens?
No, I'm just happy. I'm personally happy to get one example of a sycamore. Well, it does interest me is the looking at a field maple and a sycamore, and seeing the difference between those rather than duration of period.
There are a lot of small instruments on that are available on the internet, probably £20 or less. Is it worth a beekeeper as a sort of starter using any of those, or are they just?
No, I use Rolson, which are very commercially available, a couple of £3 tweezers. The tweezers, what you have to do is make sure they've got very good fine points. To actually do it. If you're getting the scalpels and the blades, you have to be over 18 to get the blades, so if you can get them off the internet, they're very, very cheap. If I was starting, I would start by buying individual bits which are of an economic value, and then only if the interest and you want to have more detail do you spend more money in doing it. That's the way.
I was actually meaning the little sort of child's microscopes.
Oh, the little ones.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh yeah, the little cameras. They are good. You can use, and you can see a lot of detail, but the magnification, and they work with your laptop. Personally, I've struggled a lot with them. But that was in my early days. I gave up, but I couldn't get the focus on them. But if you have something which can hold them and get it, but just as good is I use cameras which I take photographs of insects. And the cameras which you now can take photographs of insects, which autofocus onto there, normally have an adaptation on the end, which you can put on above for instance, a slide of a leg, and that takes as good a photograph as anything. And that can also feed into your laptop, so you can see more of a live image.
There seems to be a lot of disagreement online as to whether one is supposed to be able to tell the difference between Nosema apis and Nosema cerana using a microscope. What's your view on that?
It is very difficult.
Is it possible?
Yeah. What's meant to be, the way it is that the cerana is meant to be rounder and not as long. So you got 5 to 8 for a apis, and normally it's about 5 and rounder. I get a lot of people turn up my door and say, "Here's a jar of mouldy bees. Why did my colony die?" and I have to ask questions. So, if your colony dies and collapses in October timeframe, and you then take samples and it looks like Nosema in there, then it's more likely to be cerana. If the colony dies and collapses in the spring, it's more likely to be apis. So you can't just look at something, you have to know the background as to where it is, what's happened. And someone said to me, "My colony's died of chronic bee paralysis. Can you prove it, Sean?" And I said, "No." I can't prove it from the microscope. You can prove it from the symptoms of there. So it's not the only tool to actually do. You have to understand where what the causes were of it. And I have one beekeeper every year gives me the pot, and they're the mouldiest bees. They've been lying on the ground for at least 2 weeks.
Do you ever use bee bread from your hives and create a pollen slide with that?
I personally haven't. Sorry, I have. Yes, I have. Because it works just as well as taking the pollen load. So you can go into your bee bread and you can just take it out, and you've just got to make sure that you've cleaned it. So we put it in the IPA for longer, and I would mix it into the IPA. I decant it and put it into some other clean IPA and do it, and then you can get it. The problem with taking a pollen load or even bee bread is that when you take the small sample and put it onto your slide, it just fills the slide and you can't see the detail. If you have too much pollen on a view, you can't see. You want to see in different orientations to be able to get the view, and it overlaps.